Hey everybody, thank you for joining us today. I'm Linda Sula, co-chair of the Climate Change Committee, along with Nancy Bell. I hope you all had a wonderful summer. If you felt that the summer was warmer than usual, you weren't wrong. It was just declared that this has been the warmest summer on record. Yes, climate change is real. I'm so thankful that we have Jared Huffman in Washington helping to address the climate crisis. If interested, I suggest you subscribe to his email if you don't already. He gives a very concise recap of what is happening in Washington and is working to ensure that clean energy, transportation, and climate investments are being addressed. You'll find the link to subscribe in the chat. Also being included in the chat of the League will be Nancy and my contact information and the link to our page on the League website, along with other links that we will be discussing. With that, I'll turn the program over to Nancy.
Morning, everybody. Thank you for coming. As Linda said, a long summer, and welcome back, everybody. As it is a lovely day today, I have to say, even in Sausalito, we've got sun and it's lovely. So thinking back where we left off in July, we had Christine O'Rourke talking to us about climate action plans. This being the strategies that all of our cities and towns in the county are taking to address the issues about climate change. She gave a great overview of that. And again, there is a recording of that presentation on our website. So you can go there under committees, climate change, and there's a link to all of the climate change series recordings. So we're taking a little different approach with this month and next month. We wanted to cover flooding and sea level rise. And we thought we were going to do them separately. And we realized we couldn't talk about one without talking about the other. So what we've done is we've merged the topic of sea level rise and flooding into a two-part series, whereby today we're going to hear more about how do we assess what the threats are that we're facing. And next month in October, we'll hear more about what the strategies are and the adaptation needed to deal with those threats. So this is going to be presented as a two-part series. As Lynn mentioned, we're going to hold off taking questions until all three speakers have done their presentations. So we're going to get started. And our first speaker is Chris Choo. Chris is a Principal Watershed Planner for Marin County Department of Public Works, and she does a lot of work around sea level rise, flood protection, and watershed restoration. Some of you may be familiar with a program called Bay Wave, which Chris headed up that and continues to work on that. This was really assessing the vulnerability of the bayside communities to sea level rise and flooding. She also was involved with launching www.marinwatersheds.org and other websites identifying project and funding options to reduce flooding and increase habitat, working with frontline communities of color and supporting regional planning for water resources through the North Bay Watershed Association and Bay Adapt. And again, if you just refer to chat, we're trying to put in the various links to websites that will give you more in-depth information as we go through today's program. Chris also works with communities on local and regional government on sea level rise adaptation and resilience. So with that, Chris is going to take this away and tell us more about the work that she's been doing. Thank you, Chris.
Sure. Thanks, everyone. And thank you so much to the League of Women Voters for the invitation today to talk about sea level rise. I'm going to walk through some slides to go through the topic of sea level rise and flooding. This is Manzanita at Highway 101 and the interchange between Highway 101 and 1 in Southern Marin. Next slide, please. I'm going to talk a little bit about our watersheds and our water and kind of where we are in Marin in terms of some of our flood risk. Next slide. So a little bit, just really quick on watersheds. This is actually Southern Marin Watershed Guide that we developed for the Southern Marin communities, really talking about flooding and talking about the communities that they live in. So this looks like a lot of our watersheds in Marin. We have the uplands, the hills, and we fairly quickly get flat on the valley floor. We have a lot of baylands, some of which have been built upon, some of which in Marin are still available as baylands, and then we have the bay itself. And through most of this, we have creeks. We have a lot of other issues. I know this is hard to read completely, but you get the general gist that we have hills that drain to the bay. Next slide. Because of this, we actually have several different flooding types in the county. So we'll talk a little bit more about sea level rise today, which is the tidal inundation. But we also have stormwater overflow. This is basically when all of our city drains back up. When there's basically too much water, we start to have stormwater overflow. Water might be coming out from the ground through manhole covers or through pipes. We also have creeks that overflow. And then we also have isolated ponding, just low spots where water just may not drain quite properly. Next slide. And we have a lot of this history in Marin County. So we've experienced flooding quite frequently. This is Lucky Drive in 1973. This is Highway 101 in the middle. Next slide. This is Highway 37. The second time it flooded in 2019. And that's the Marin portion that you're looking at there from the sky. Next slide. This is Highway 101 or Highway 1 at 101. You see 101 overhead, and this is from 2014 when this area was fairly deeply underwater. Next slide. This is at Diablo Avenue at Novato Boulevard in Novato, right at the transit center, more or less. And this is back in 1982, which is one of our big storms in Marin County. Next slide. And then this is along Francisco in San Rafael. And I always forget which dealership this is now, but it is no longer Mercedes-Benz. But this is right along the frontage road next to 580-101. Next slide, please. And lastly, just not to leave out the coast, this is Stinson Beach back in 1978. And those are waves from the ocean washing past that house. Next slide. So we have a lot of this history. Sometimes it's both a good and bad thing. We have some experience with flooding, but a little bit more on just the climate change situation and how it's different from just the flood situation we've experienced. Next slide. So I wanted to give a little bit of background. We are seeing, rise in global temperatures for the land masses on Earth. 2019 is actually the hottest year on record. 2020 is now number 2. And this is for the whole year. And then 2016, which is listed here, is now number 3. And so we are seeing increasing temperatures across the entire planet. Next slide. And then we see that the oceans absorb some of this heat. So we don't have that much land mass. We have a lot of water, but obviously as the planet's forming, the top 328 feet of the ocean has warmed about 0.5 degree since 1969. And so the oceans themselves are getting warmer. When water is warm, it expands. Next slide. We're also seeing, as part of kind of the global look, the loss of ice from land masses, from polar caps and from glaciers. And this is important because it's basically adding to that water in the oceans. Next slide. So locally, we're really fortunate in the Bay Area. We have a gauge at Christie Field that's been in operation since the late 1800s. And we've had about 8 inches of sea level rise total in San Francisco Bay since that gauge has been in operation. The one note I'll point out here is that it has been increasing since about the 2000s. And so we're definitely seeing a faster rate, but you can see that overall it's about 8 inches so far. Next slide. And all of this is tied back to our greenhouse gas emissions. A lot of the science and a lot of the really technical work that happens internationally and then locally at the US and at the state really ties back to these scenarios that are being discussed and measured, basically resulting in different outcomes for sea level rise depending on how good we are about actually reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. So the blue line is our emissions our sea level rise, and then the rainbow colors at the end basically project sea level rise with different emissions scenarios. So depending on how we do as a planet will impact how much sea level rise we see across the globe. Next slide. So I feel like sometimes at the end of all this background, you just kind of want to crawl back in bed like a little kitten and just hide out under the covers. Next slide. I'm hoping it's not really that bad. As the person that works on this, the county, you know, we are doing quite a bit. So next slide. So I wanted to point out, I've just talked a little bit about the global scale. I wanted to point out locally what this all looks like. So 3 feet of sea level rise along the Marin shoreline pretty much restores a lot of our former wetlands to wetlands. A lot of our bay levees, many of which are just old farm levees, will be overtopped with about 3 feet of additional water. Next slide. And we did complete a vulnerability assessment back in 2017. And this basically counted up all the stuff in the county that gets wet with 6 different scenarios. So we looked at 10, 20, and 60 inches of sea level rise. And so that gives us kind of a range that seems in line with what we've seen, in line with kind of high tides and what we get during some of the big storm events. But 60 inches takes us pretty far into the future. It's a lot more water. And we did each of those also with the 100-year storm because that's what we're used to seeing with kind of the FEMA standards, which are our flood standards. So you'll see that we did a vulnerability assessment for those 6 scenarios. And then we looked at all these different assets as well as each community. And so each of the communities has a section that talks about all the things in the community that are impacted with this amount of sea level rise. Next slide. The report itself is a bunch of tables, a lot of short text. It's actually really easy to read if you just read a portion of it, either your community or perhaps an asset you're really interested in. You don't really have to read the document from beginning to end because it is quite large once it's all pulled together. What we really did notice when we looked at the whole thing, obviously there are impacts that are more significant. You know, if you live in a home that is forecast to be flooded, that's obviously quite significant. We look at as a county as kind of the impacts that are countywide, and many of the impacts really do extend beyond just the shoreline. You know, there are road networks, there are a lot of our utilities, and that shuts down a lot more than just that shoreline in terms of impact with that flood water. So we're looking at kind of how to plan holistically, how to plan as a county and what we should be doing in terms of partnerships, in terms of funding, in terms of planning that'll help all of us plan better in the future. Next slide. And so one of the ways that I can show you this is by looking at some of the impacts to access to our hospital emergency rooms. So there's 3 emergency rooms in the county, more or less. Novato, Kaiser in San Rafael, and then Marin General. And this basically in the colors shows access to those hospitals with 10 inches of sea level rise and the 100-year storm. 10 inches of sea level rise is something we see just in the variation of the daily tides right now. And the 100-year storm would be the 2005 storm, maybe the 1982, 83 storms, those really big storms that really do happen, not as frequently in the county, but certainly have happened. So that level of water does start to impact how people can get to these emergency rooms. And of course, this is assuming you're in your passenger vehicle trying to drive yourself to the hospital. Obviously, emergency responders have different equipment that can get you to these hospitals if needed. But the areas in red are places that actually don't have a clear route because the roads are flooded. The areas in orange are very compromised. And then the yellow and the green less so. So you can see kind of how this starts to impact you, even if you don't live right in those blue, those blue areas that showed up as being underwater. Next slide. Overall, just in terms of transportation, just one of the ways we've looked at this since completing that vulnerability assessment, we've basically counted up some of the different impacts for the transit providers, so Golden Gate, Marin Transit, some of their paratransit and school bus routes. We've also looked at things like, the roads themselves. We have the park and rides, and then obviously some of the big transportation hubs themselves. The ferry terminals are obviously at the water's edge, and even though the ferries themselves float, all that infrastructure, the parking, the walkways and everything all have to stay dry in order for them to function. And then of course, SMART is located along the bay shoreline on former North Pacific railroad tracks. So they're definitely in that vulnerable area as well. Next slide, please. And so, looking kind of at what the summary of that looks like, this is looking at Manzanita, or the intersection of Highway 101 at Shoreline Highway in Southern Marin. We started to quantify kind of all the different ways one flooding location can impact a community, and we're trying to plan around this. The solutions still aren't necessarily easy once we know all of this, but it helps us understand kind of how communities are impacted. It also helps us do a better job working with emergency responders, with fire, with transit providers to think about what we need to do in order to plan for this long term. Next slide. And this is just another way of looking at that. And this is the percentage of highway miles that are flooded by county. And so the highest percentage of highway miles flooded is actually Highway 37 in the Sonoma County stretch. But you'll see that all of Marin's highways are actually in that top 5 after that. And this is for the entire Bay Area. And so we rank fairly high for the near term. And then increasingly, as we have more and more sea level rise, our ranking shifts a little bit because more people are impacted in other parts of the Bay Area than in Marin. We're not as densely populated. And so for us, that also means that we should be planning soon so that we can be addressing this before we get to the periods when all of San Jose is flooded and Marin no longer matters as much in terms of the big picture in the Bay Area. Next slide. So now I've gone from telling you all the bad news and wanting to crawl under the bed to feeling a little bit like this is kind of end times and horrible. And so next slide. I want to end by just talking a little bit about what our opportunities look like and the good news in all of this. Next slide. We've been working around the Bay Area with partners. This is actually an approach that was led by the San Francisco Estuary Institute and the San Francisco Estuary Institute and SPUR, looking at a new way of planning for shorelines for sea level rise. And basically they are similar to watersheds. They just look at kind of the lower portion of the watershed area. They also look at some of the low-lying areas that are underwater. And so trying to plan for what we can do, looking for ways to break up the bay so that we can actually plan with the right jurisdictions and with the right partners. And really looking for nature-based solutions. Most of us don't want to live behind a giant levee or a big wall. And so what are the opportunities to actually use nature to help protect our communities? Next slide. We have a lot of different adaptation measures. Unfortunately, at least as of right now, there's nothing new or novel. Technology has not been able to somehow just move the water that's problematic in the bay and put it into our reservoirs or do something crazy, at least not quite. I guess that's desal in some ways, but the adaptation measures are really looking at a number of existing nature-based measures that can have some benefit. We're looking at some of the regulatory and policy type tools that we can use to help shift how we adapt over time. And then there's a lot of traditional engineering approaches. I just listed 2 of them here, but we have all of this available to us. The trick with sea level rise is we need to plan together as communities. We need to plan kind of like the map before showed, in these areas that actually address all of the low-lying areas along the shoreline together at once. Next slide. We have a lot of adaptation projects that are underway in Marin. This map is probably not quite entirely up to date, but all the different dots show different planning efforts. And this map is available on our Sea Level Rise website as well as our Watershed website. So you can definitely go and take a look, find out more information about all the different efforts in the county. Next slide. And so what I really wanted to leave you with this very last slide is kind of a sense of hope. I think a lot of the work that's already underway gives me a lot of optimism about what we can do to start to address sea level rise. The other thing that does give me hope, and this does require a bit more of a shift, is that we're at a place and time in a lot of our cities and our communities where we need to be doing some work to upgrade our infrastructure. A lot of things are getting to the end of their life, and we do want to make improvements. In planning for sea level rise and planning for climate change in general, we need to be thinking about fire and flooding, all these terrible things, but they also help us plan for better communities. We also, in addition to the climate change factors, we need to think about, additional housing for the populations that want to be here. And we can do a lot of this by planning for better communities and planning for a better future. And so to me, that's the one upside of planning for sea level rise, is that hopefully together we can come up with a lot of solutions to these challenges that we have today. So thank you very much. This is my contact information. Feel free to reach out to me anytime, and then I'll take questions at the very end.
You're muted, Nancy. Nancy, you're muted.
Okay, sorry about that. Thank you so much, Chris. And while Lynn is getting the next slide deck ready, I want to tell you a little bit more about our next speaker. I also just want kind of the bottom line from what I hear Chris telling us about is that it's not, people talk about sea level rise and they say, well, I live up on a hill. It's really not about where you live. It's really about how you get to where you need to go and the services that you need to live your life. So it's not really about where you live. And we're going to hear more about that as we move through this program. But keeping that in mind, that sea level rise is something that's going to be impacting everybody in Marin in one manner, shape, or form. And now to learn a little bit more about what's happening on the coast side, Leslie Lacko is going to be our next speaker. She is a senior planner working on climate change adaptation with the Marin County Community Development Agency. She earned both a BS in Conservation and Resource Studies and an MS in Environmental Science Policy and Management from UC Berkeley. She's worked in watershed and coastal management for the State Coastal Conservancy, Alameda County, and the San Francisco Bay Conservation and Development Commission, known as BCDC. She began working on sea level rise at BCDC, where she was responsible for developing some of the first sea level rise maps and corresponding state policies for adapting to sea level rise. She's currently managing 2 nature-based adaptation studies and the update of the countywide plan safety element to include climate change adaptation goals, policies, and implementation measures. So Leslie, thank you so much. And let's hear more about what you've been doing.
Thank you, Nancy. I'm not sure who's doing the slides. Oh, there we go. Okay. Okay. So I'm going to present about what the county has been doing on the coast side of Marin, West Marin. And most of the planning that we've been doing is through the Community Development Agency. We work very closely with the Department of Public Works, which is where Chris Choo sits. And just so that everyone knows, we have regular meetings across our departments within the county. And actually Chris deserves a lot of credit for that, because she makes sure that that we do coordinate across county departments. So with that, let's go to the first slide. So I put this map in here just to make sure everyone is familiar with the West Marin area. All the green on the map shows federal lands, most of which are reserved as parklands. And the rest of the shoreline is unincorporated Marin County, and that is where the county has jurisdiction. There are no incorporated cities or towns out that way. The blue stripes actually show the coastal zone, which I'm not really going to talk about much here, but that is the area that where our local coastal program is affected. let's go to the next slide. So in 2015, I believe, and it might have been earlier than that actually, the county started a vulnerability assessment on the coast side of Marin. And this was a fairly early time to be doing vulnerability assessments. There wasn't a lot of guidance the way there is now. And we got to a good place eventually by doing 2 reports, the vulnerability assessment and then an adaptation report. Next slide. Now, the way a vulnerability assessment works is that first you identify the exposure. So all of those maps that Chris was showing you, and I'll show you some as well, are mapped with different layers that show different assets, like highways and other infrastructure like pipelines and electrical facilities and residences. And then those are overlaid with areas that would flood. And that's and all of those layers have all that data in them. And so we use that to identify the exposure. And then you analyze the sensitivity and the potential impacts in addition to that. Evaluating the adaptive capacity is where it gets a little trickier. And then conducting the vulnerability scoring is never just scoring with a number. It's always looking at the complexities and the overlaps between all of the different impacts. Now, this kind of guidance didn't really exist at the time that the vulnerability assessment was done on the West Coast. This is new guidance from the state, and it's what we're working with for our safety element update with new climate change adaptation policies. Next slide. There are several communities along the West Marin shoreline that are at high risk from sea level rise, and Stinson Beach is one of them. This map shows the scenarios that we used for that vulnerability assessment. There were 5 scenarios, and there are 2 10-inch scenarios that are paired with an annual storm and a 20-year storm, and a 20-inch scenario with a 20-year storm, 40-inch with a 20-year storm, and then 80 with a 100-year storm. This map shows the coloration is a little strange in these maps, but the red areas are essentially the areas that will be hit first and with sea level rise, and then the yellows are the more extreme scenarios. So next slide. So one of the major differences on the coast, between the coast and the bay, is the wave activity that's on the coast and the way that sediment is carried up and down the shoreline. And so the other thing that we did for this vulnerability assessment was we mapped how erosion, how the shoreline would change over time due to erosion. So with those same scenarios, we looked at where the beach would be over time, and those blocks of colors are showing structures that will be impacted by erosion as well. So along Stinson and in the sea drift area, most of those structures are right down on the beach. Next slide. This is a different way that we showed impacts in the vulnerability assessment, just showing structures that would be impacted by sea level rise, just inundation alone, rather than the big swath of color. And this is Bolinas and the downtown area. Next slide. And then again, this is the erosion impacts at Bolinas. And if you know Bolinas very well, you know that they've had a lot of erosion, and there are a number of seawalls in place already to try to prevent more erosion along those bluffs. And I'll just say right now, seawalls have some pretty significant environmental impacts, more so on the coast than on the bay shoreline. So a hardened structure on the coastline actually will increase the rate of erosion in other areas on the shoreline. So these houses that are up on the mesa at Bolinas that are subject to erosion are a big concern in that area. Next slide. So this map is showing another aspect of coastal protection that's really important in our local coastal program and also under the Coastal Act, which is maintaining public access to the coast and recreational opportunities. So here where the feet are is where there's currently coastal access, and the different colors show how that will be impacted over time. So, and just to point out, downtown Inverness is not really downtown. I always laugh when I see how that was labeled. It's just Inverness. Next slide. So from after assessing the vulnerability, we did the adaptation report, and the adaptation report is not a plan, but it does identify a lot of adaptation strategies. Next slide. And in identifying those strategies, we really wanted to make sure that the public understood what the vulnerabilities were and how different strategies might come into play, at least at a very basic level. And so we developed the game of floods, and we brought that out to members of the public. We played at community meetings. This picture is high school students playing in one of their classes. And I think at Marin Academy, maybe? I think that's what it was labeled. But we had members of the community playing that game, and that game started actually in Richardson Bay and it actually had Richardson Bay on it with actual adaptation strategies for something that I think DPW was doing with Catherine Sears, former Supervisor Sears. And then it became very popular and a great way to communicate these adaptation options. So in the game, you have to identify ways that you could adapt a community, help a community adapt to rising sea level rise. Next slide. We eventually made a boxed version of the game, which you can actually buy on our website now. Not through us, but through another manufacturer. And it's slightly trickier, but it still helps you develop an understanding of what kind of adaptation strategies might be feasible and how difficult it can be to figure out how to save a community. Next slide. So the other part of the adaptation report were these long tables and lists of all the different types of adaptation strategies that could possibly be used on the coast. And these tables were grouped by the type of strategy. So strategies could be used for accommodating sea level rise. They could be used for just protecting against it, and or they could be used as a measure, as a way to retreat from sea level rise. And I just saw the chat come in. marinslr.org is our website, and you can find all the reports that Chris and I have been talking about, and the game links to those things there. And then next slide, please. The other thing that the adaptation report did was it identified specific areas and potential strategies for each one of those areas. And these are just potential strategies, because what I'm going to say next is that each potential strategy requires a lot of work to figure out whether or not it's actually feasible in that area. So from here in the report, the next phase was really to look at some very specific ideas. Next slide. So we started 2 feasibility studies. And the first was a study of whether or not dunes could help protect Stinson Beach. And it would protect Stinson Beach in 2 ways. One of which is to feed the beach, to provide sand to the beach as waves are coming in and eroding the shoreline. They would naturally erode a dune system, and that sand would then feed the beach and keep it from eroding. That beach is a huge public draw, so that is one thing that could help with dunes. And then the other is to protect the structures behind it. And when we look at things like this, it's important to note that it's a feasibility study and it's not something the county is committing to do. I don't think there's any feasible way for the county to commit to protecting homes along the shoreline when there are so many other things that will need protecting. So the dune study was the first thing that we looked at, and then also living shorelines in Tomales Bay. Both of these are nature-based adaptation measures, and what's important about nature-based adaptation is that on the coastline, because hard structures have such so many environmental impacts, and they're almost impossible to approve under the Coastal Act anyways. It's really important to look at other methods that have fewer environmental impacts. The drawback to these types of protection measures are that they're not necessarily long-term. So they will provide a measure of protection for some time into the future, but in the long term, ultimately, the ocean will take over. Next slide. So in the Tomales Bay Living Shoreline Project, next slide, we looked at how living shorelines in Tomales Bay could provide flood and erosion protection for the natural and the built environment, how we could maintain public access and recreational opportunities. And we wanted to get to a point where we had preliminary designs for 2 to 5 pilot projects. Next slide. Oh, next slide. Here's some examples of living shorelines. This is one example showing an oyster reef that's submerged, and it makes sort of an artificial reef that attenuates wave activity. And there's actually an example of that in San Francisco Bay, right off San Rafael Point. Next slide. Some eelgrass is shown here, which also sort of dampens wave activity. And of course, eelgrass is really valuable for cleansing water and providing fish habitat. Next slide. And then Tombolo and Cuspit beaches was one thing we looked at a lot for Tomales Bay, because there is a fair amount of sediment in the bay, and these types of structures, if you can use wood or other means to provide a place for sand to accumulate, you can help increase the size of a beach or protect an area of coast using sand that accumulates there naturally. Arambaroo Island in Richardson Bay is a good example of how that might work. So next slide, please. What we did in Tomales Bay is we actually used the framework that was established in the study that Chris talked about, the adaptation framework for nature-based projects. We ended up having 6 different sites. Actually, it was closer to 8 different sites, 2 of which were eliminated very quickly. And working with those sites until we had 2 sites that were really good potential sites for living shoreline projects. And this one right here is Cypress Grove. It's owned by Audubon Canyon Ranch. And there are a number of different types of living shoreline strategies here that could be used in combination to provide a level of protection for the facilities that are there now, which are mostly research facilities. And they range from placing sediment along the shoreline to putting rocks in place, to integrating with the Tomales Bay Native Oyster Restoration Project to put oysters in place as a wave attenuation strategy. Next slide. The other location was at Martinelli Park, and here we looked at a range of solutions as well. And these, of course, are still draft concept plans. But here we looked at cleaning out non-native vegetation from the stream, perhaps straightening it to a location where the sediment would come out and provide more sediment for the tidal marsh that's existing there now. And then also a horizontal levee of sorts, but basically a levee that would sort of slope and provide marsh-like habitat up to its top. And that's shown where it says raise setback existing trail with ecotone slope there. And the reason that we chose this site is because there are a number of options available, but also because this is the first place where Sir Francis Drake Highway floods, and it is the only access point into the upper area, of the shoreline there in Inverness. So both of these are only concept designs, and they would need a lot more design. So I would say they'll be at about 20 to 30% design by the time this project's done. And then the next phase would be to design them out to 100% or something close to it. Next slide. Then at Stinson Beach for the dune study, we really looked at enhancing habitats and public access and supporting recreational opportunities, and then providing flood and erosion protection. And next slide. What we ended up with on that study is a system of 4 dunes, and this is just a proposed what's feasible and what's best at Stinson Beach, not an actual project. So a system of 4 dunes, which are sort of vegetated mounds. The vegetation really holds the sand in place. The 4 dunes make the most sense because they're spread out over a larger area. It's still usable beach. And they're pretty attractive too. If you go down to Lindemar, which is what's in this picture on the bottom here, they did a 4 dune restoration there, and it's really beautiful. Next slide. This was another option we looked at, which really wouldn't work there, which is a dune embankment. Next slide. A cobble berm really wouldn't work by itself there, but it turned out to be a really good way to help anchor the 4 dune system. So we looked more closely at that. Next slide. So we ended up with the sort of a 4-dune and cobble berm system combined. And for each project reach in that project, we had either we had a more natural alternative and then a sort of structural and natural alternative. So in most cases, the natural alternative was just the 4 dunes. And then a natural and structural alternative was the combined 4 dunes and cobble berm, which would really be the strongest alternative, but may have more permitting challenges, essentially. Next slide. So that concludes my presentation, and hopefully it takes you through really the level of assessment and feasibility studying that's necessary to get to a point where you can implement an adaptation project.
Thank you, Chris. Leslie. So next month, we talked about having speakers to talk more about these adaptation strategies. Stuart Siegel is going to be one of our speakers, and he was hands-on the project of Arambaroo Island. So next month, please plan to join us again to hear more of the realities of what we are doing or what the county is doing to address these using certain strategies, not just in a planning mode, but actually moving forward to make them happen. So our next speaker is going to be Paul Jensen. Paul holds a BA in Geography and Urban Planning and AICP Planning certification. Paul, you have to tell us what that is. He's also a native San Franciscan and has lived in Marin for over 40 years. He is recently retired, but we've pulled him out of retirement to talk to us today. He was the Community Development Department Director for the City of San Rafael. As the director, he was responsible for overseeing city planning, building, and code enforcement. He worked for the City of San Rafael for over 13 years, but also worked as a planner for San Rafael from 1980 to 1988, and also had a planning consulting business. Paul provided drafting, oversight, and management of the recently adopted San Rafael General Plan 2040 and Downtown Precise Plan. Included in these documents are policies and programs that proactively address sea level rise that's projected in the San Rafael community, focusing on planning, awareness, and adaptation. So Paul, take it away.
Good morning. Thank you, Nancy. I'd like to thank both Linda and you for inviting me today. I really appreciate it. It's nice to feel wanted after you retire. And I have to clarify and state that I'm not here today representing the city of San Rafael. I did work for the city for many years, but I was deeply involved in this topic with the city for a good 15 years. And I'm not an engineer, I'm not a scientist, I'm a city planner, as Nancy mentioned. So I was responsible for taking priorities and developing policies and goals and implementing programs to make sure that those policies and goals were met. So, and Nancy mentioned the San Rafael General Plan 2040. For many of you who are familiar with general plans, it's a roadmap that is required for every city, town, and county in California to develop for a forecasted period, generally 20 years. And that effort started a couple of years ago, and it couldn't have been better timing for the topic of sea level rise, because it gave us an opportunity to fold into that plan, planning ahead for sea level rise. If we could move on to the next slide. Next slide, please. I want to mention, I always love to show this slide. I came across this aerial photo, probably about 15 years ago in some of the city's archives. This is the central San Rafael area. If you could see the area in the lower left, that's what used to be the Hutchinson Quarry, which is now Larkspur Landing. And the area to the right, it looks like a big cove, which is Baylands. That's all filled now. And those two straight lines are Anderson Drive and what is now I-580. It used to be a rail line, and everything in between is all marsh. And that area has been filled. And so that's really telling, because these are the areas, this particular area is all subject to flooding and is part of the 100-year flood and is susceptible to sea level rise. So I just wanted to share that with everyone. I always start with this. If you could move on to the next slide, please. Just some background. The city of San Rafael and the planning area of San Rafael has a history of flooding, primarily because it did a bad job of filling floodlands many, many years ago in some real vulnerable areas. And between 1950 and 2016, there were 19 flooding events that were declared both either a federal or a state disaster. So that gives you an idea on how vulnerable, particularly the central San Rafael reach is. San Rafael first recognized rising tides as a potential threat around 2007. At that time, there was not a lot of information about sea level rise and technology and just general knowledge about projections of sea level rise. But it came about when the city was reviewing what is now called the Village at Lacko and Marina development. Some of you I know are familiar with that project. And we had to find ways to see how to address sea level rise. And there were some things built into the project that were just thought of by the developer in the city to add some protections, some of which are things that we're considering today. But interestingly, we really had no regulatory authority to add some of these things. We did primarily just to see what we could to address what was kind of an unknown issue at that time. Fast forward in 2014, the city prepared a white paper on this topic, which basically cataloged all the information that was available since 2007, and also identified at a high level areas of vulnerability and then potential areas for adaptation. And these are areas that you could look at to help fight against sea level rise. And then, of course, Bay Wave came along in 2017. Chris Choo went through that assessment. I always like to thank Chris and the county staff for developing that vulnerability assessment, which gets down to a very local level. And it is our foundation for our planning for sea level rise and adaptation in San Rafael. Subsequent to that, we adopted a local multi-hazard mitigation plan, which covers not only sea level rise and some basic steps for sea level rise, but other topic areas such as wildfire. In 2019, the city updated its climate change action plan and basically updated information and policies on sea level rise. And then lastly, just in August, the City Council adopted the General Plan 2040. And I'm going to get into what's covered in there relative to this topic. If you could move on to the next slide, please. So we have a safety and resilience element in our general plan, which is generally the element in the general plan that takes a look at flooding, hazards like seismic risk, hillsides and landslides and such. So that was the perfect home for the topic of sea level rise, because it's so closely linked, as Nancy mentioned earlier, to flooding. And flooding is obviously increasing as we move along in our world right now. So what this gave us an opportunity to do was to infuse some new policies and programs addressing this topic, supported by two documents that were prepared for the plan. The first is a flood risk and sea level rise adaptation report, which I will go over in a few minutes. And the second is a more technical guidance study, which, like what Leslie mentioned, what has been done on the coast, takes a look at some of the early adaptation tools and measures and applies them as suggestions for certain areas that we can use moving forward when we prepare an adaptation plan. If you could move on to the next slide, please. So I wanted to give you an idea of some of the areas of San Rafael that are vulnerable to sea level rise, and not surprising, the blue areas are areas that are either in the FEMA 100-year flood zone or are on the border of the 500-year flood zone. The lower area on the map is obviously the central San Rafael and I-580 convergence with 101. You saw that aerial photo I gave to you earlier. This is probably the area that's the most impacting in San Rafael because it's the most developed. And in this area, by 2050, it's expected that the tides will rise upwards of 2 to 4 feet. Next slide, please. So what we've included in the General Plan 2040 Safety and Resilience element are 7 policies and 16 programs addressing sea level rise. I want to start by saying that these policies and programs really are a starting point. It's setting the table for dealing with sea level rise, particularly adaptation. So its focus is on mapping and data consistency. There's no corporate or geographic boundaries with sea level rise. And so we're relying on the use of information like, for example, the Bay Wave as our foundation. And the key is making sure that that data and information is kept current, because every couple of years, a lot of this information changes. So that's one of the focuses in the policies and program. The other is awareness and disclosure, and this is for property owners who buy in areas that are vulnerable or have businesses or homes in areas that are vulnerable to sea level rise. It's also a framework for regulation and then planning for adaptation. We adopted with the general plan update a sea level rise projection map, which the city has committed as one of the programs to update every 5 years, knowing that that information is going to change. There's also a commitment in the programs to address sea level rise in new development and particular city capital projects. And there's a couple of tools I'll mention in a minute or so here to address that. But moving ahead, if you're going to invest, particularly in infrastructure, that's going to supposed to last for 50 years, you have to accommodate for rising tides and increased flooding. So that's a commitment that the city's made. There is a program in the plan to adopt a minimum construction elevation for areas that are susceptible to sea level rise, and to adopt a sea level rise overlay zone. This would be a first of its kind to some extent in the urban areas of Marin County. The sea level overlay zone would basically mirror what is presented on the sea level rise projection map. And that's used as a basis to identify where you'll want some construction elevation requirements. Like, for example, one of the programs recommends that any development within an area susceptible to sea level rise, if someone wants to put an addition on their building or to build a new building, if it's a substantial change, you have to not only meet the FEMA flood control standards for the 100-year flood requirements, which is a higher elevation, but add an additional 3 feet of elevation above that to accommodate sea level rise. There are some recommendations to improve and expand the Shoreline Levy system. And then there's a strong commitment to prepare and adopt a sea level rise adaptation plan. And this was a program that was identified as a high priority by the City Council in adopting the General Plan 2040. And interestingly, it didn't show up in the IG.
We've lost the sound. You're
Paul,
on
you're
mute,
on mute.
Paul.
Okay. I don't know if you heard me, but last night, the San Rafael City Council adopted a resolution declaring a climate emergency. was primarily focused on sea level rise, but it shows a commitment by the city to address climate change. So there are a lot of people watching in the community, knowing that sea level rise adaptation plan is part of a program in the general plan and a high priority. So I'm assuming that our city council is going to keep this in check and address it accordingly. So if you can move on to the next slide, please. So I'll first touch on the two supportive reports that were included as an appendices in the general plan. The first is the flood risk and sea level rise adaptation report. Again, this document sets the stage. It's an initial guidance on how an adaptation plan is to be developed and adopted, and what is to be included in that plan. Could you move on to the next slide, please? I think what's important is that we're building from the current resources and utilizing the Bay Wave as a foundation for the data and the resources in developing this adaptation plan. It's also one that has to be community-based. Chris had mentioned Chris, or maybe it was Leslie mentioned the game of floods. That's an excellent tool for getting public input and looking at measures for adaptation. That might be a tool being used moving forward when we develop that plan. The initial guidance on what's to be covered in the plan includes a requirement to establish clear objectives, again, developed through a community-based process, identifying policies and regulatory measures, the specific and tools and strategies that are appropriate for the various areas of San Rafael that are susceptible to sea level rise. We have some areas that are undeveloped, some areas that are heavily developed. So these tools and strategies will vary dramatically. And then lastly, and most importantly, identifying funding measures and funding sources for implementation. A lot of these measures for adaptation are very, very costly. And like many communities in the county, the city will be seeking out resources for assisting and subsidizing the funding of a lot of these projects. So the city is always on the lookout for grants and funding sources. And I'll be going through a couple in a few minutes here on what have been tapped so far. Next slide, please. So the second supportive study, the Sea Level Rise Adaptation Technical Guidance Study, the city hired ESA, Environmental Science Associates. They're an environmental consulting firm. This firm was chosen. They're actually working on one adaptation project in San Rafael. So they're very familiar with our planning area. They were chosen because they have the technical skills to take what we put together so far at sort of an academic and qualitative level and apply hydrological science, biology, and engineering to come up with some initial ideas, much like what Leslie mentioned for the Jumpstart Adaptation Report on the coastline. So they've taken some of the information from our white paper that we prepared back in 2015 and basically amplified that. And so if you can move on to the next slide. What ESA did was they took a look at our entire planning area, and they divided the planning area into 6 regions. So they looked at a granular level using Bay Wave and some of the resources, these 6 regions, and they've come up with some suggestions for each of these areas. So I'm going to give you a couple of samples here. If you could go on to the next slide. This sample is the regional example is the Canal South area, and this is essentially the Canal neighborhood and a lot of the commerce area. And I particularly earmarked this because this is the area that's probably will be the first hit with sea level rise, according to the predictions at the regional level. And this is an area that has the highest concentration of low-income residents in Marin County, and also the highest concentration of commerce that's critical for sustainability in Marin. Commerce being services that are used countywide, many of which you can only find here. So this area is particularly vulnerable. So they've come up with some short-term and long-term adaptation measures. And it's a combination of engineering, or what we call hard engineering solutions, and then also nature-based solutions. Next slide, please. This is another area which is on the north side of the canal, or the north side of the San Rafael Creek, which is also vulnerable. ESA came up with a number of both short-term and long-term adaptation measures. Next slide, please. So what they're suggesting in this first study to touch on moving forward with an actual adaptation plan is a canal feasibility study, and that is going the next step in looking at the feasibility of some of the recommendations in their report. Again, reinforcing the use of the overlay maps. In this particular area, because it's completely urban, some of the short-term solutions include upgrades and improvements to pump stations, many of which were either upgraded or built after the 1982 storm event, one of the slides Chris showed you earlier, which devastated this entire area. So it's revisiting those pump stations to upgrade them to address sea level rise for at least some short-term protection for this area. Next slide, please. And some of the other short-term projects, raising a shoreline at the west end of Harbor Way, installing tide gates in certain locations, and doing a few other things for study along the San Pedro Peninsula. Next slide, please. The ESA report does have some long-term solutions, like, for example, a shoreline levy system, creating a hard edge and raising the levee system along the East San Rafael shoreline. Also some nature-based measures. Leslie touched on some of the measures that have been identified for the coastal area that are suitable for outboard areas of the San Rafael Basin in particular, and also in North San Rafael and along the San Pedro Peninsula. We have one project now, that's a Scornia Marsh Restoration Project, which is an example of a nature-based project that's being planned for now outside the levee system at the mouth of the San Rafael Creek. There's also some suggestions for a potential retreat meaning returning some undeveloped areas to tidal action. So they've identified that as well, which would be looked at in further detail as part of the adaptation plan. Next slide, please. I do want to mention some related actions and reports that the city has pursued or taken along the way as we've developed these policies and programs. First, the city took a serious step in identifying the Southeast San Rafael area and the Canal area as a priority development area. This might seem counterintuitive, but priority development area is basically an area where you want to concentrate growth. Why would you want to concentrate growth in an area that may be susceptible to flooding? But it's got a greater value in that the priority development area designation provides the city with access to money and resources for planning, not only for growth, but for adaptation, for climate change adaptation. So this was an important step. The city also pursued several grants. A couple of them were not awarded, but I put these up here. The Canal Alliance grant through PG&E, and also the Prop 68 Ocean Protection Council grant. I identified these primarily because we tried, we failed, but we will continue to pursue that. I mentioned, I think further down, Measure AA. If I haven't put Measure AA down here, I should have. That is the parcel tax that is regional, and that money goes to grants for adaptation projects like the Tiscornia Marsh Habitat Restoration Project. The city actually pursued that. Stuart Siegel was involved with it in trying to get some money to do an adaptation project at the Spinnaker Marsh. We were turned down twice. I'm sure that'll surface again. And then there are several other things that we mentioned. Many of you might be familiar with the Marin Grand Jury Report that was released in 2020, included a list of things that the community should be doing in Marin County to address adaptation for climate change and sea level rise. I mention this because I have to say the city should get some good marks for actually pursuing some of the recommendations from that grand jury report. Next slide, please. So in terms of access to the information I gave you, the reports and the General Plan 2040 policies and programs, here's a link to where you can find that information. I can tell you that what I just presented to you was presented to the City Council in October 2020 as part of a progress report on the General Plan update. And that's a link to a more detailed report on this presentation, as well as the two supportive studies that I just went through. So I am finished.
Thank you, Paul. Everybody, I'm processing.
You're on mute.
You muted again.
Okay, sorry. I'm just,
You're
on
muted.
mute again.
It happened again.
okay, stop. Okay, I just put a link in the chat to the grand jury report. It's very interesting reading. I highly recommend it. So thank you again, Paul. So much of what you heard today was about adaptation. You didn't hear anything about mitigation, which is what has been the framework of a lot of our previous presentations, particularly in terms of reducing greenhouse gases. So now we're moving into this area of adaptation, which the grand jury report also focused on. So I think you'll find this a different approach, not approach, but a different perspective of just saying these things are happening. We can't change them. We can't push the sea back. We can't make it stop rising. So what are we going to do to deal with it? So thank you again, Paul, and all three of you. We couldn't have picked three better speakers to address these issues. So thank you so much. And now we're going to move into the Q&A. And as we suggested, put your questions in the chat. If you want to ask your question yourself, just put a question mark and we will call on you to unmute yourself and ask your question. So until then, I do have a few things that have come up. So all three, let's see, this first one. Well, actually, Lynn, would you tell us your story that you told me about shoreline erosion at Martha's Vineyard?
Yeah, sure. So I grew up going to Martha's Vineyard every summer. I'm Lynn, hi, everybody. And I just went back for the second time. I went in 2015 to visit, hadn't been there since about 77 was the last time I had been there. I used to go to the shoreline right down the street from my house, and there was about a 50-yard berm before you drop down to the sea to the jetty. We used to climb down there and collect mussels. It was wonderful fun. So in 2016, when I went back, the berm was, instead of 50 yards, it was probably 30 yards. And they'd closed off the road by it because they knew that it was coming. It was going away, basically. It was being eroded. So I just went back this summer. I got back about a week ago, and currently there is no berm at all in 5 years. The berm is now, instead of 30 yards, it is literally 2, and the whole road along the edge of the whole north side of the island has been blocked off to traffic. You can't go there anymore. You can walk on the road, but there's no access to the beach. There's no access to the jetties. It is going fast. So it was really eye-opening to see the difference in such a short period of time.
Well, that's distressing.
Yeah.
Okay, now I'm trying to remove your spotlight, Lynn. Hold on, everybody.
Got
I
it.
wanna remove everybody. You got it. Thank you. Okay, so let's see. What else do we have here? Elaine is asking, what are some of the countywide services in the Canal area? I think, Paul, you alluded to that.
I don't know if I quite understand that question. The countywide services?
Elaine, do you want to expound on that?
Yeah.
You indicated that in the Canal area, there were a lot of countywide services.
Oh, okay.
And so I was wondering what.
Well, what I was referring to was commerce. Services, that are part of our life here in Marin County. Like, for example, this is an area where you get your auto repaired, or this is an area where your plumber has their office or their shop. Things that are part of our life that we need. And that's what I meant in terms of services, not necessarily services for people, but or
Got it.
services like social services, but commerce type services.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. So another thing that actually, I'm going to ask this question. You've talked about different feasibility studies and concept designs and such, and I don't know who wants to answer this question, but there seems to be a lot of time and effort that goes into thinking about what we could do. When do we move into the place of action, and how long is that going to take to actually implement some of these strategies? Who wants that one? Paul, go ahead and unmute yourself, Paul.
Yeah, I'm happy to start and then see if Chris and Leslie want to chime in as well. I mean, I think that's a very fair question, but we always start we work in government, and we have to justify what we do and what we require. And also, if we're going to be pursuing things that require money from other sources like federal grants, you have to have your ducks in order. You have to adopt a plan. You have to demonstrate you have a plan in place and that's a priority. Because if you don't, you get nowhere with a grant application to fund an actual project. Also, these particular plans usually are linked to environmental review and clearance under the California Environmental Quality Acts. So, for example, some of the projects that Leslie mentioned on the coast, they require environmental review and clearance. So you have to study and look at those things first before you can get a permit or even get money to implement them. That's why it's frustrating. It takes a very long time. Tiscornia Marsh is a good example. They're going through the planning process right now. Well, why can't they just go out and start, doing their restoration work? Because they're doing work in waterways that involves permits from multiple agencies. And even though maybe all of these agencies might be totally supportive of this effort, they still have their rules, their regulations, and you have to go through environmental review. So that's why it takes a long time. And again, it's frustrating that the time passes, but you have to set the stage right now, and that's what we're doing.
Leslie, Chris, anything to add to that?
I would just add that one of the things that we did for both the Tomales Bay Living Shoreline Project and the Dune Study at Stinson Beach was we prepared a regulatory roadmap. That's what we called it at the beginning, but it's not a roadmap. It's so complicated. It's a table that you can walk through step by step, and the steps are numerous. So I just wanted to throw that in there since Paul mentioned some of the regulatory hurdles. And we also convened a panel of regulatory agencies that reviewed both those projects and reviewed the steps that we laid out. And even with everyone in the same room, it's really complicated.
So are we regulated into a corner here? Is there some state of emergency whereby these regulatory agencies might just throw that stuff away and start over based on the current situation? Easier said than done.
Well, some are working on revising and updating their policies, and in some cases their laws. But I mean, I've heard Chris speak to this a lot of times with marsh restoration and mitigation requirements. It's a really interesting conundrum that she has a lot of experience with. Chris, I don't know if you want to add anything.
Yeah, it is complex, and there are different impacts. And part of it with sea level rise is that it changes over time. So not only are the conditions changing over time in terms of water, but also the conditions are changing over time in terms of the species on land and in the wetlands that need to be able to migrate. And so a lot of these things have an impact now or have an impact later, and it's difficult to plan for both. And we're all learning how to do that. The other thing I just wanted to add in terms of why it's so difficult, in almost none of these cases does the county somehow have, or the city have all the jurisdiction. We may set the planning and the zoning and the guidance. There's very few places in the marine shoreline where lands are largely public. And I think the exceptions are in West Marin and some of the big national parks, but we're generally talking about private property that we need everyone to agree on if we are going to move forward with some of these ideas. So even when the end goal may be relatively straightforward, and we can all sort of look at it and say, yes, we don't want to flood and we want to protect ourselves. What it actually takes to be able to do those kinds of things when you're talking about numerous private property owners is very different. And then also just the uses and our expectations of the coast are very different. And so I like to point out San Rafael because they have the harbors and marinas. You know, people want to actually be able to access the water. In other parts of the community, you may actually want to be, closed off from it. You don't want it in your backyard. And you need to find solutions that address all those things, plus fit into the regulatory framework, plus, are cost effective, plus something that you can have some assurance will actually work by the time you finish building it, since our planning process takes so long.
Can I add a couple of things there, Nancy, if I could? First of all, and you know this, and I know Kiki Laporta is on this, is in this Zoom meeting as well. We found, obviously, sea level rise is not even acknowledged in the California Environmental Quality Act. Flooding is, if you go to the CEQA guidelines, sea level rise is not even in the review cycle for the topic areas to be covered. And, that's obviously something that I think will happen at some point. And since it's such a long, it's one of those things that it's going to build up over time as opposed to a single flood event. I have to say that, it's not looked at as an emergency. I don't think it's, I don't think it has historically been looked at it as an emergency. And yes, if we had an emergency, let's say we had a natural disaster that occurred and we had flooding and you needed to fix something, there are emergency project provisions for all of these agencies that allow that to happen without having to go through the bureaucracy. And so emergency projects kind of get a free ride, but it's usually at the cost of a response to a disaster. So I just wanted to mention that as well. That's when they happen now.
Okay, wow. All right, I have more questions here. This is great. Denise Lucy is asking, in the city of San Rafael's 2040 plan, are there mitigations for flooding on the San Pedro Road Peninsula? Who wants to take that?
Well, I could, since I worked on the general plan, and yeah, what's interesting about the San Pedro Peninsula is that there's a seawall right at the edge of the Glenwood Peacock Gap neighborhood that is a sturdy seawall, but many people who have lived out there have seen that overtopped at high tides, and when we've had extreme storm events, including king tides, that water is overtopped, and that lagoon that's out there that surrounds the golf course is a blue area on the sea level rise map. So that is an area that's vulnerable to that. There are some in the report that I summarized that was prepared by ESA. There are some recommendations for that area that will eventually make their way into an adaptation plan. It doesn't mean that at some point along the way, before that adaptation plan is actually developed and adopted, that if opportunities come along, that some of those improvements can be considered. But there are some recommendations in the plan, and one of them is to take a look at reinforcing that levee, and also looking at the possibilities of an outboard nature-based type, what they call ecotone, or horizontal marsh. So Denise, you might want to take a look at that supportive study in the link on the General Plan 2040.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you. Wandine Trainer has a question. Is it feasible that the possible increased ferry services should trigger mitigation along the Corto Madeira Creek and Bay frontage across from San Quentin to require living shoreline to deal with both erosion and sea level rise?
It may. I'd need to know a little bit more, but they did actually just Golden Gate Transportation, Bridge and Highway Transportation District, their really long name. They did actually just restore a bunch of the wetlands fairly near the ferry terminal itself in kind of the Corto Madeira Marsh area. And so they've been actively working on that. They do have mitigation projects underway. But I think as we continue to see additional impacts, additional projects, there'll probably be additional mitigation measures as well. Those are determined by the regulatory agencies largely, and they do reach out and partner with local jurisdictions, but they are mostly determined by the agencies depending on impacts.
Anybody else have something to put on there? Okay, we have now Kate Powers is asking for all three of you. With respect to Leslie's comment that ultimately on the coast, the ocean will take over long-term solutions, how do the sea level rise vulnerability assessment and feasibility studies impact current project development review at planning commissions? And how does the current review of projects inform or reflect regional planning? It seems that all development going forward should meet a minimum a do no harm determination to adjacent areas and the regional sea level rise adaptation interests. Got that?
Well, I guess I was the one that made the comment, so I should take a stab at answering that question. So we are looking at policies for sea level rise adaptation to address that. It's a one of the things about the long-term impacts of sea level rise is we're talking about sea level rise 100 years out when we're talking about long-term. And when we're talking about short-term, we're talking about 20 or 30 years out, generally. And it's really hard to put a timeline on that. I mean, you saw the graph that Chris put up and all the possibilities for sea level rise connected with all the different emissions scenarios. But I would say, generally speaking, that's sort of what we're looking at. So it's difficult to regulate development for what may or may not happen 100 years from now. But yes, a do no harm policy does make sense. I can't say that that's something that the county is going to be supportive of or not, but we are looking at different policies for that. And we're doing that in the context of the safety element update and the adaptation planning that will come with that. So
Paul, Chris, do you have anything to add?
I think that's a really good question because it's like as we sit and wait, the world doesn't stop. And we have these projects that come along, and how do you deal with them on a one-off individual basis? I think the best thing that we can do is to commit to getting all the communities in Marin to pursue and adopt an adaptation plan. It's no different than, let's say, a land use plan for an area where it says, you know, you can have housing here. And right now the allowance is not for housing, but if someone comes along and wants to do housing, then they kind of start from scratch and have to do that and go through a plan amendment. But the one-off projects until an actual plan is adopted, I think depends upon the project and the size of the project. I think in San Rafael, the best thing to do right now is to try to take some of that low-hanging fruit. So for example, if you have a developed area like the Southeast San Rafael area, and one of the measures is to recommend that if you're going to build in that area, you have to build at a higher elevation. You can easily require that the project comply with that. But to have that project, let's say, fund a more major improvement like an increased levy or an ecotone or a horizontal levy that's part of a greater area, it's going to be much more difficult to do without a plan. So again, I think it has a lot to do with the size of the project. I can tell you when I used to look at projects I would try to stretch the envelope as far as possible on some of these things, like we did at Loch Lomond Marina. We got the developer to basically raise the building pads on those in that development area so that they are considerably higher than even the FEMA requirement. And that was done without actually a plan. So it was just really a matter of negotiation. But I guess going back to my comment, it depends upon the size of the project.
I
hope
bet they're
that-
glad at Loch
clear.
Lomond that they did that.
Pardon me?
I bet they're glad at Loch Lomond that they chose to do that.
Well, the developer's glad, the property owners are out of the FEMA zone. And if you look at the sea level rise maps, surprisingly, the area inboard of the Marina Basin, most of it is not susceptible to sea level rise, and that's landfill. And so so there was some effort done there that actually I think worked out in the end. Doesn't mean that with as we move forward that area may get worse, but at least for now it's not susceptible to sea level rise. So based on the projection maps that we have now.
Right. Okay, we've got two more questions and then we're going to wrap this up. Paul, you mentioned an existing levee system in San Rafael. Is the existing system in good condition?
No. I'll tell you, none of the levees in Marin County are in the condition for even to meet FEMA standard, except for the one at Hamilton, which is fairly recent. And I think, Chris, you could probably confirm that. Is that correct? That's the only like core certified levee in Marin County. So all of the levees, the hard line levees along the shoreline will have to be raised in conjunction with something else, or perhaps not raised and another maybe nature-based measure is done. But even the Southeast San Rafael levee, which looks and appears to be very high, there's only one stretch that is at the highest elevation, and it's because inland of that levee was a landfill it's the San Quentin landfill where Target and Home Depot is, where the site elevation is upwards of 27 feet above sea level. But that's an anomaly. That's a complete anomaly. You have other stretches that are close to sea level. So to answer your question, no, none of them are really suitable at this point to protect those areas from long range increased flooding.
Okay, final question. Leslie, you referred to 10 to 20 and 100-year storms. What are they?
Oh, a 100-year storm, excuse me, a 100-year storm is a storm that is big enough that uh, it will not be, that one storm in 100 will not top it or exceed it. So basically, it's a 1 in 100 storm for one given year. So it's very misleading that it's called a 100-year storm. It's just that it's one storm that's big enough that it would take another 100 storms before it gets exceeded in that given year. Does that make sense?
Could that
All-
be
it's
like
all
what happened in
probability.
New York?
What?
Could that be like what happened in New York?
I don't know what size that storm was. But you can use the same probability for, the 20-year storm. So that would be a smaller storm, right? Because it would only take another 20 storms before it succeeded.
Thank you. That was confusing. I appreciate your clarifying that. Thank you.
Okay, so in closing and thanking our speakers, Kiki wanted to acknowledge huge thanks to all three of you for your participation in helping the California League research, helping to guide the California League research and advocacy regarding sea level rise and planning guidelines and regulations in the state of California. Can you talk a bit about what is happening in this regard statewide and in the Bay Area in terms of preventing further development investment in vulnerable areas?
I can start by saying that there's now conflicting housing guidance that allows for building that overrules a lot of our local planning. And I think it's certainly needed because we need more housing, but it'll be interesting to see how that actually unfolds and where that development unfolds. I think, as Paul mentioned earlier, there's definitely intelligent ways of doing this. And there's ways that we can utilize this to address, the current problems of housing insecurity and housing shortfalls, as well as plan for the long term. It would be a real shame if we had to protect whole new things in places where they currently don't exist. But certainly in terms of infill and just other higher density housing, there might be additional opportunities. But that's one area in which the state is currently kind of at odds a little bit, in that they haven't developed great guidance that looks at both of those emergencies at the same time. There's a lot of things happening at all times, it feels like, in the Bay Area and in the state. The state has adopted parts of its budget and signed some of the various legislation. And so there is some additional funding for adaptation work that's coming down through various grant programs, through various state agencies. In the Bay Area, I feel like the big news recently has been the release of the Bay Adapt. I can't remember what that document's called now. Bay Adapt put together a guiding document for all 9 Bay Area counties. And there's a framework there for just looking at kind of how we should be coordinated and how we should be working together. And it took a lot of public participation, as well as groups that really did focus on committing to spending their resources and their time coordinating on adaptation planning. It is fairly broad, and at this point there's less to argue about because they're broad goals and guidance, but I think we'll continue to work on that as a region, given our interconnectivity and just a lot of the shared risk that we have as a region.
Well, I think, Chris, again, you've hit the nail on the head on the need for collaboration. All these agencies need to work with each other and move a little faster. Paul, did you have something else you were going to say?
Actually, I have more faith in our regional resources than I do the state of California. Chris had mentioned conflicts here and there with housing legislation and all that other stuff, but we have some incredible resources here, and Bay Adapt is one of them. The San Francisco Estuary Institute, among others, are, what's nice is what they're putting together, all of us could use, and we're going to be able to handle this in a consistent way. Yeah, I just wanted to mention that.
Thank you. Again, thank you all three of you. Every